My name is Jade Ellis, and I am 29 years old. And the Thanksgiving dinner where my family laughed at my savings account happened 3 years ago when I was 26. And I smiled at the table and said I was working on it, and went home that night and transferred another contribution to the investment account my family did not know existed and went to sleep. I want to start at Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving is where the visible part of this story begins, even though the actual story had been building for 4 years before that dinner. The real start is when I was 22 and chose a path my family dismissed and began building something in the only condition under which I could build without interference: complete privacy. I need to explain the family dynamic before I explain the finances, because the dynamic is the reason the privacy was necessary, and understanding the reason makes the rest of the story make sense. My family was organized around conventional markers. My father had worked in insurance management for 30 years and had a specific view of what constituted professional legitimacy that was rooted in titles and institutions, and the recognition of people who shared his framework. My mother had a similar framework and a particular gift for communicating it through questions that sounded like curiosity and were actually judgment. My brother Marcus had graduated from a business school and gone directly into financial advisory work at a mid-sized firm, and had, from the beginning of his career, occupied the position of the sibling who had figured it out. I had gone into individual finance, not in the way Marcus had gone into finance through a firm and a client base and the visible infrastructure of institutional employment. I had gone into it from the inside, studying markets and real estate and compounding structures with a specific focused interest of a person who finds the mechanics of money genuinely interesting, rather than instrumentally interesting. By 22, I had a job in financial analysis at a firm I had not talked about much because the firm was small and the title was not impressive on its face, and every time I had mentioned my work in the past, it had produced a conversation about whether the company had good benefits and whether I was thinking about something more stable. I had stopped mentioning it. I had also started building, quietly, in the specific way that building is possible when you do not talk about it, without the interference of other people's opinions about what you should be doing with money and why, and whether your approach was too aggressive or not aggressive enough, or too unconventional or insufficiently diversified. I built without audience. I made decisions without consultation. I researched and calculated and executed, and over 4 years had constructed something that was considerably more substantial than anything my family would have guessed, from my lifestyle, which I had kept deliberately modest, partly because I preferred modest, and partly because modest did not invite questions. Then Thanksgiving arrived, and the savings account came up, and my aunt said, "Sweetie, you cannot build a future on a savings account." And my father said, "Some people think frugality is a strategy, when really it is just the absence of ambition." And my brother Marcus made a comment that was technically a joke, and my mother laughed, and I smiled and said I was working on it. The savings account they were discussing was a checking-adjacent account I used for daily expenses. It was modest. It was designed to be modest. The money I was serious about was not in that account. It was in places that did not come up at Thanksgiving dinner because I had not told anyone they existed. I want to be specific about what I had built by 26 because specificity is what makes this story real rather than a vague narrative about financial vindication. I am not going to share exact numbers because the numbers belong to my financial history rather than to this story. What I will tell you is the structure. By 26, I had 4 years of disciplined investment in a diversified portfolio I had been building and managing myself, with the specific focused attention of a financial analyst who finds the work genuinely interesting. I had a real estate position, a rental property in a mid-sized city I had purchased at 24 with a down payment I had been saving since I was 21, which generated monthly income that fed back into the investment accounts. And I had been named to the advisory client list at a firm that managed accounts above a certain threshold, a threshold that was not modest. The advisory firm was connected to the financial industry in my city in the specific networked way of firms that serve a certain level of client. My brother Marcus worked at a different firm in the same industry in the same city. The two firms were not directly related. They did share, as firms in the same industry in the same city tend to share, a number of regulatory and compliance relationships that became relevant during an audit. Audits happen, they are standard practice, and they are not inherently dramatic. What made this particular audit significant to this particular story was that it produced documents that were shared through regulatory process with associated firms in the same compliance network, and one of those documents was a client list. Marcus saw the list on a Thursday in February. I know this because he called me that Thursday at 6:43 in the evening, and his voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. Not his confident voice, not his managing voice, the voice of someone who has just encountered information that has reorganized several things simultaneously and who has not yet decided how to receive it. He said, "Jade." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "Are you a client at Meridian Advisory?" I said, "Yes." There was a pause. Then he said, "The minimum investment threshold for Meridian is—" He said the number. I said, "I know." Another pause, longer this time. Then he said, "How long?" I said, "About 2 years for Meridian specifically." He said, "And before that?" I said, "I have been building since I was 22. He was quiet for what I estimate was about 45 seconds. Then he said, "You never said anything?" I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Marcus, think about the Thanksgiving dinner where Dad said frugality was the absence of ambition." He did not respond immediately. I said, "Now think about whether you actually want me to explain why I did not tell the family about my finances." He said, "I understand." He said it quietly and without argument, which was the most honest response I had ever received from him on any subject. I want to tell you what happened after Marcus's call, because the after is where the actual family story lives. Marcus told my parents. I had not asked him to, and I had not asked him not to. I understood that the information was going to move once it had reached him, and I had made my peace with that understanding before I answered his first question. The audit had made the privacy no longer possible, and I had known from the moment I heard his voice on that Thursday that the season of building without audience was ending. My father called on a Saturday morning. His voice had the quality of a man who is approaching something carefully because he is not entirely sure of his footing. He said he had heard from Marcus. I said, "I know." He said, "Jade, I did not know." I said, "I know you did not." He said, "The Thanksgiving dinner." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." He said it clearly and directly, without the qualifications that sometimes make apologies feel like transactions. I said, "I appreciate that." I said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Okay." I said, "The reason I did not tell you was not that I was keeping a secret from you." I said, "The reason was that every time I have tried to share what I am doing with my work and my finances, the conversation ends with advice I did not ask for, and a comparison to what Marcus is doing that is not flattering to me." I said, "I built in private, because private was the only condition under which I could build without interference." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I understand that." He said it the way people say things when they have genuinely understood something, rather than when they are performing understanding. My mother called the following evening. Her call was different from my father's. She had been processing for longer, and the processing had produced something more specific. She said, "I have been thinking about the things I said at Thanksgiving." I said, "Okay." She said, "I was not trying to diminish you." I said, "I know you were not trying to." I said, "The effect is the same, regardless of the intention." She said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She said, "I want to understand what you have built. Not because I think I deserve to know now after not paying attention before, because I am your mother and I am asking." I told her, not everything, the broad shape, the structure, the years of work behind it. She listened in a way I had not heard from her before, without the organizing of a response while I was still talking, without the framing of the information in relation to Marcus, without the specific management of the conversation that I had learned to expect. She just listened. When I finished, she said, "I did not know you were this person." I said, "Mom, I have always been this person." She said, "I was not paying attention in the right way." I said, "No." She said, "I am paying attention now." I said, "I know." I said, "I can see that." I said, "That is worth something." Marcus and I had the conversation I had needed to have with him for years, 2 weeks after his initial call. Not about the finances specifically, about the dynamic, about the Thanksgiving dinners and the questions, and the way the family had organized its understanding of success around his career and his trajectory, and had applied that template to me in a way that consistently found me wanting. He was more receptive than I expected. Not immediately. It took about 20 minutes of conversation before the receptivity replaced the defensiveness, and I could see the defensiveness dissolving in real time, which was something I had not seen from Marcus before. He said, "I think I made it worse." I said, "Yes." He said, "I could have said something different at that dinner." I said, "You could have." He said, "I thought you were being stubborn about asking for help." I said, "I was not being stubborn. I was building." He said, "I did not know the difference from the outside." I said, "I know." I said, "That is partly why I did not show you the inside." He said, "What would it have taken for you to tell us?" I thought about that. I said, "I think I needed to know that what I said would be heard rather than managed." I said, "Every time I had tried to tell this family something about my life, it became a conversation about what I should be doing differently." I said, I had reached the point where the most efficient thing was simply not offer information that was going to be redirected. He said, "That is fair." I said, "It is also sad." He said, "I know." He said, "I am sorry for my part in it." I said, "I know you are." I said, "I believe that." The family dinner that happened 6 weeks after the audit was different from all the family dinners that had come before it. My father asked me questions about my work with the specific interest of a person who is actually curious, rather than performing curiosity to be polite. My mother did not compare me to Marcus once across the entire evening. Marcus and I talked directly with each other about what we were actually doing, rather than talking in the coded way we had talked for years, each of us editing in real time to avoid the parts that had historically produced friction. It was not a perfect evening. Family dinners are not perfect, but it was more honest than any family dinner I could remember, and honest is where real starts. I want to tell you what I think this story is actually about, because I have been working out how to articulate it since the Thursday evening when Marcus called, and his voice had that quality I had not heard before. It is not about being right. The satisfaction of having been right while people laughed at my savings account is real, and I am not going to pretend it is not. When my father said frugality was the absence of ambition, and my aunt said, "Sweetie, you cannot build a future on a savings account," I was building a future on something considerably more substantial than a savings account, and the irony of that is not lost on me and never will be. But the story is not really about the irony. The irony is the part that gets attention. The story underneath it is about the condition that made the building possible. Privacy. The deliberate, sustained, carefully maintained decision not to offer my financial life up for my family's assessment. That decision was not passive, it was active. I made it consciously and renewed it continuously across 7 years of building, every time a Thanksgiving dinner produced a comment, and every time I went home and continued doing what I was doing in the silence of someone who has decided that the audience does not serve the work. If I had told my family what I was building, they would have offered opinions. The opinions would have been wrong in ways they were not equipped to understand they were wrong. The opinions would have slowed me down, or redirected me, or introduced doubt at exactly the moments when certainty was what the building required. The privacy was not secrecy, it was insulation. My family has access to my life now in a way they did not have before February. Not full access. I am not interested in full access. I am interested in honest conversation with people who are listening rather than managing. That is what has changed. Not what I have, how they receive it. My brother Marcus and I have dinner together now, outside of family events. We talk about work in a way we never talked about work when the family was organizing the conversation. He asks questions, I answer them honestly. He tells me things about his own work that I don't think he has told anyone before. The complications and the uncertainties, and the things that are harder than he makes them look at family dinners. We are becoming people who actually know each other, rather than people who perform being siblings in front of an audience. That is what the audit produced, not just information about my finances, an opening for the honest version of a relationship that had been running on the managed version for years. The savings account is still there, the one they laughed at. I have not changed it because it still serves its purpose: daily expenses, accessible, modest. Everything else is elsewhere, doing what it does, growing in the quiet way that things grow when they are not being interfered with. My father said at that dinner 6 weeks after the audit that he was proud of me. He said it directly and without qualification, and without the particular look that pride sometimes comes packaged in when it is also managing something. He just said it. I said, "Thank you." I meant it. Those two things happened at the same time, and both of them were true. And that is enough. That is the whole story. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.